Out here, where the Sahara's golden sea swallows history whole, the wind carries whispers of a lost empire. It speaks of a kingdom forged not in gold, but in the black, formidable strength of iron, a civilization so powerful it once brought Egypt itself to its knees, ruled by pharaohs whose skin was as dark and rich as the Nubian earth they commanded. We are standing on the ghosts of their greatness, a land they built and then, tragically, unmade. How could a kingdom at the apex of its power, a master of industry and warfare, simply vanish into the sands of time? The answer lies buried beneath our feet, a cautionary tale written in slag and dust. This is the story of the Kingdom of Kush and its magnificent capital, Meroë. It is a chronicle of ambition, innovation, and a fatal ecological blindness that echoes into our own modern age. We are about to embark on a journey south along the Nile, far beyond the familiar pyramids, to uncover the saga of these forgotten rulers, to piece together the puzzle of their rise and the self-inflicted wound that led to their fall. Make sure you subscribe and join our expedition into one of history's most profound environmental blunders. The story of Meroë is not just ancient history. It is a lesson that has never been more relevant. Let us travel back in time, following the great river as it carves its way deep into Africa. Past the cataracts that churn the water into white foam, we enter a land the Egyptians called Taseti, the land of the bow. This was Nubia, a realm of fierce warriors and immense wealth. For centuries, its relationship with its northern neighbor was a complex dance of trade, conquest, and cultural exchange. Then, around the year 750 before the Common Era, the balance of power shifted dramatically. The students became the masters. A line of Nubian kings swept north, conquering Egypt and establishing themselves as its 25th dynasty, the legendary Black Pharaohs. Though their rule over Egypt was relatively brief, lasting less than 100 years, it fundamentally changed them. They returned south not as vassals, but as inheritors of a pharaonic legacy, bringing with them Egyptian gods, writing, and the ambition to build an eternal kingdom of their own. They established their new capital at a strategic point on the Nile, a city called Meroë. Here, sheltered from the political turmoil of the north, we witness the birth of a uniquely African superpower. Meroë was destined to become the industrial heart of the ancient world, a bustling metropolis whose fame would reach the ears of scholars in Greece and Rome. What fueled this meteoric rise? The answer was a technology that was changing the world: iron. While other empires were still largely reliant on bronze, the Kushites of Meroë had discovered vast deposits of iron ore, and more importantly, the secrets to smelting it on an industrial scale. Let us imagine the scene. Hundreds of furnaces, glowing like angry red eyes against the night sky, belching smoke and heat. The air would have been thick with the rhythmic clang of hammers on anvils, the sound of a kingdom forging its own destiny. Meroitic steel was legendary, their weapons superior, their tools more efficient. This was not just industry, it was the engine of an empire. With this technological edge, Meroë became an unrivaled economic hub. Caravans laden with Meroitic iron goods, gold, ivory, and exotic animals traveled across the continent, while ships sailed down the Nile and into the Red Sea, connecting Africa to India and the Mediterranean. The city itself grew into a marvel of architecture, with its own distinctive pyramids, smaller and steeper than their Egyptian counterparts, marking the tombs of their royals. Here, we see a civilization at its zenith, a vibrant fusion of African and Egyptian cultures, rich, powerful, and seemingly invincible. Yet, Even as they built their monuments, they were sowing the seeds of their own destruction. The insatiable appetite of the iron furnaces required a colossal amount of fuel. The only source available was the vast acacia forests that surrounded the city, woodlands that sustained the region's delicate ecosystem. Day after day, year after year, for nearly a millennium, the forests were cut down. Let us picture the landscape slowly transforming. What was once a fertile savanna, teeming with wildlife and capable of supporting agriculture, began to wither. The trees that held the soil in place and drew moisture from the air were gone. The engine of their prosperity was consuming the very land that gave it life. This was not a single catastrophic event, but a slow, creeping crisis. The rains became less frequent. The topsoil, no longer anchored by roots, was swept away by the wind, leaving behind barren sand. The Nile's annual flood, once a source of life-giving silt, now carried less and less fertile material from the denuded highlands. The kingdom's agricultural base, the foundation of any ancient society, began to crumble. The great forges of Meroë, once a symbol of its strength, had become a curse, and the mountains of black slag that still surround the ruins today are a stark monument to an economy that devoured its own environment. The stage was set for a final, silent collapse. Let us walk among these silent black hills that dominate the horizon. They are not natural formations. These are mountains built by human hands over 1,000 years, colossal heaps of industrial waste. Each dark, glassy piece of slag we see is the ghost of a tree, the remnant of a fire that burned to smelt iron. This landscape is a testament, a grand and terrible monument to Meroë's ambition. We are standing in the middle of what was once Africa's first and greatest industrial zone. The sheer scale of it is difficult to comprehend. Archaeologists estimate that the production of iron here was so immense it would not be rivaled in the Old World for centuries to come. Imagine the air we are breathing now, thick with the haze of hundreds of furnaces. Picture a city that never truly slept, its heart a constant, fiery pulse. Meroë was more than just a capital. It was a workshop for a continent. Its smiths produced everything from razor-sharp swords, which gave Kushite armies a terrifying advantage, to durable hoes that could break the hard African soil, promising agricultural bounty. This metal was their currency, their power, their identity. Caravans stretching for miles would depart from here, their camels laden with this black gold, heading east to the Red Sea ports and north into the Roman world. We can almost hear the cacophony of languages in the marketplace, a blend of Meroitic, Egyptian, Greek, and dialects from deep within Africa. It was a true melting pot, a globalized city 2,000 years before the term existed. The rulers who presided over this thriving metropolis were a continuation of the Black Pharaohs, yet they had forged a uniquely Kushite identity. Here, we encounter the powerful Kandakes, the queen mothers who often ruled as sole monarchs. These were not women who stood in the shadow of men. They led armies, negotiated treaties, and commissioned magnificent temples. In one famous instance, the Kandake Amanirenas led her forces against the invading Roman army around 25 before the Common Era, fighting the legions of Emperor Augustus to a standstill and securing a favorable peace treaty. We see in Meroitic art a civilization confident in its own skin, blending pharaonic traditions with distinctly African aesthetics. They even developed their own written language, a script we can read phonetically, but whose meaning still largely eludes us, locking away their stories in a code we have yet to break. This vibrant society, however, was sustained by a singular voracious appetite. The forests, once thought to be an infinite resource, began to recede. At first, it was unnoticeable. Woodcutters just had to walk a little farther each day. Then, the journey took a full day. Soon, whole regions were stripped bare. We must understand this was not an act of malice, but a slow, creeping blindness driven by prosperity. Each successful trade mission, each military victory, demanded more iron, which in turn demanded more charcoal. The very symbol of their strength, the ever-burning furnace, became a pyre for their own environment. The consequences began to manifest not in the ledgers of merchants, but in the baskets of farmers. The rains, once predictable and life-giving, grew erratic. The thin topsoil of the savanna, no longer held in place by the roots of acacia trees, blew away in great choking dust storms that would have turned the midday sun a blood red. The fertile floodplain of the Nile, which had nourished civilizations for millennia, began to shrink as the denuded land could no longer retain water. The kingdom that had mastered the fire of the forge found itself defenseless against the slow creeping fire of desertification. Their industrial miracle had become an ecological curse, and the foundations of their great civilization were turning to sand beneath their very feet. To truly grasp the tragedy unfolding, we must get closer to the fiery heart of the operation itself. Let us peer into the mechanics of these Meroitic forges, for this was not simply a matter of throwing wood and ore into a pit. What we are witnessing is the pinnacle of ancient pyrotechnology, a process honed over generations into a kind of sacred alchemy. The Kushites developed a unique type of bloomery furnace, a clay and slag structure designed for astonishing efficiency. Their true genius, the secret that gave their iron its legendary quality, lay in how they introduced air into the inferno. Instead of simple blowpipes, evidence suggests they engineered systems of terracotta tubes, or tuyères, that may have preheated the air before it blasted into the furnace core. This seemingly small innovation had monumental consequences. It allowed their forges to reach temperatures far exceeding those of their contemporaries, perhaps over 1,500 degrees Celsius. At such heat, the iron ore did not fully liquefy, but formed a spongy mass of metal, a bloom with far fewer impurities. We can imagine the master smiths, figures of immense respect and perhaps even fear in Meroitic society, reading the color of the flames and the smoke, knowing the precise moment to pull the glowing bloom from the furnace's belly. It was a craft shrouded in ritual and secrecy, a power to transform rock into something that could arm a soldier or feed a village. This was not mere industry, it was a partnership with the very elements. The result was a product that was, for all intents and purposes, an early form of steel. The intense heat and careful management of charcoal fuel allowed more carbon to bond with the iron, creating a metal that was harder, more flexible, and capable of holding a lethally sharp edge. A Meroitic spear point or axe head was not the brittle, crude iron implement of other nations. It was a superior weapon, a superior tool. We can now understand how the armies of the Kandakes could stand against the might of Rome. They were not just fighting with courage, they were fighting with better technology. This metallurgical supremacy was the bedrock of their economy and their military confidence for the better part of a millennium. This power, however, bred a dangerous complacency. The forges demanded a constant, voracious diet of charcoal, which could only be made from mature hardwood trees. For every single kilogram of iron they produced, we estimate they needed to burn 10 to 20 kilograms of wood. Let that number sink in. Generation after generation, the supply of fuel seemed as boundless as the Nile itself. The sound of the axe in the forest was the sound of progress, of wealth, of security. No one seemed to notice that the rhythmic echo was getting farther and farther away from the city walls each year. It is here that we find the central devastating irony of Meroë. The very artisans who possessed the genius to master controlled combustion on an industrial scale, who could command fire to create the world's finest metal, were utterly blind to the slow, uncontrolled combustion of their own environment. They held the power of a god in their hands, the ability to transform the earth, yet they failed to see that this same power was turning their world to ash. The smiths in their workshops, surrounded by the glow of creation, were oblivious to the whispering death of the forests that sustained them, a silence creeping ever closer to their magnificent city of iron and fire. To understand the sheer scale of the industry that would both create and consume Meroë, let us pivot our gaze northward and journey back a few centuries. We must travel to a time before Meroë became the heart of the kingdom, to the era when its rulers looked upon a fractured Egypt not with envy, but with a sense of profound duty. Around the year 744 before the Common Era, the land of the pharaohs was in disarray, a patchwork of petty kings and rival warlords. From their capital at Napata, nestled by the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal, the Kushite kings saw a spiritual crisis. They, who worshipped the Egyptian gods with a fierce orthodoxy, believed the northern lands had lost their way. Here we can appreciate that the invasion that followed was framed not as a conquest, but as a crusade. We are looking at a moment when the student, having mastered the lessons of the teacher, returns to find the master's house in ruin. The Kushite king, Pa, saw himself as the chosen champion of the god Amun, destined to reunite Egypt and restore its piety. His campaign, launched around 728 before the Common Era, was a masterpiece of strategy and religious propaganda. We can picture his flotilla moving down the Nile, his soldiers, hardened by life in Nubia, facing the disorganized armies of the northern princes. Pa's stela, a massive granite slab detailing his victory, tells us of a pharaoh who commanded his troops to cleanse themselves before battle, to fight not for riches, but for the glory of their god. The result was the establishment of Egypt's 25th dynasty. For the first time in history, the great kingdom on the Nile was ruled by men from deep within Africa, the Black Pharaohs. They did not govern as foreign occupiers. Instead, they embraced the role with a passion that shamed their Egyptian predecessors. We find ourselves witnessing a renaissance. They initiated a vast building program, constructing and restoring temples with an architectural style that consciously echoed Egypt's old kingdom, reaching back over 1,000 years for inspiration. They were not just ruling Egypt, they were attempting to resurrect its soul, to make it great again by restoring its ancient traditions. This period of rule, though it would last less than a century before the unstoppable Assyrian war machine pushed them back south, fundamentally transformed the Kushite kingdom. They returned to Nubia not as defeated exiles, but as true pharaohs who had tasted the power and immense resources of a continental empire. They brought with them Egyptian artisans, scholars, and a renewed sense of their own divine destiny. This grand imperial experience ignited an ambition that could no longer be contained by the old capital of Napata. They needed a new center, one better protected and situated to exploit the vast resources of the south. This conquest planted the seed of the industrial megalopolis Meroë would become. The glorious triumph of the 25th dynasty set the stage for a far greater and far more costly enterprise. The grand dream of empire, once realized in the north, now required a new home, a fortress of industry and culture far from the meddling grasp of its neighbors. Let us follow the royal court as it journeyed south, past the treacherous cataracts of the Nile, seeking the perfect location. The old capital, Napata, had proven vulnerable. They needed a place of power, a location chosen not just for its spiritual significance, but for its raw, earthly potential. And they found it here, in a wide, fertile bend of the river, a place we now call Meroë. We are standing at the junction of strategy and destiny. To the east, a network of wadis offered natural highways for trade caravans heading to the Red Sea. To the west, the vast grasslands promised grazing for herds, but beneath the red soil lay the true treasure, immense deposits of iron ore. Here, beginning around the 6th century before the Common Era, we witness the birth of a city conceived in fire. This was no accidental settlement that grew over time. Meroë was a statement. We can envision the royal architects laying out a grand vision, a city with a sacred core of temples and palaces, a bustling royal necropolis for their pyramid tombs, and, crucially, a dedicated industrial quarter. It was a metropolis designed around its primary function, the transformation of earth into iron. The Kushite rulers, having learned the hard lessons of geopolitics in Egypt, were building a kingdom that would stand on a foundation of its own technological might, a power that could be forged and stockpiled. Imagine the first teams of prospectors and smiths arriving. They would have found a landscape vibrant with life, a savanna woodland stretching as far as the eye could see, teeming with acacia and combretum trees. This was a paradise of fuel, a seemingly inexhaustible resource waiting to be fed into the furnaces. We can almost hear the first axe blows echoing through the quiet woods, a sound that initially must have signified progress and prosperity. The first forges would have been small, experimental. But as the smiths perfected their craft, drawing on generations of knowledge, the scale of their operation exploded. The smoke from Meroë became a permanent feature on the horizon, a signal to the ancient world that a new power had risen. This city became a magnet for talent and ambition. People from all over the Kushite kingdom and beyond flocked here, drawn by the promise of work and wealth. We see the emergence of a complex society, the revered priests who sanctified the forges, the powerful smiths whose secrets were guarded like state treasures, the merchants whose fortunes were built on the trade of iron goods, and the armies of woodcutters and charcoal burners who toiled at the very first step of this monumental process. For several hundred years, this system worked in perfect, brutal harmony. More iron meant more wealth, which funded a stronger army, which in turn protected the trade routes that brought in even more wealth. It was a self-reinforcing cycle of growth, a spectacular boom that made Meroë the envy of Africa. As we look upon the city in its prime, we see a civilization at the peak of its confidence, a people who had harnessed an almost magical power. The orange glow of the forges at night would have made Meroë look like a city of fallen stars, a terrestrial constellation of human ingenuity. They believed their prosperity was limitless, their resources infinite. The very air, thick with smoke and the metallic tang of cooling iron, was the smell of their success. They were deafened by the roar of their own creation, unable to hear the quiet fracturing of the world that sustained them. The sound of prosperity in Meroë was the distant thud of an axe. For centuries, that sound had been a comfort, a steady heartbeat of production and security. But let us now follow that sound, walking away from the capital's smoky haze, and join the men whose job it was to feed the furnaces. Their journey was once a short stroll into a dense woodland. Now we find them trekking for hours under a punishing sun, their path leading them into a depleted, wounded landscape. We can see the memory of the forest in the scattered, thorny bushes that cling to the arid soil, the last stubborn survivors of a once great ecosystem. Each tree they fell was a victory for the forges, but a defeat for the land. This was not a war of armies, but a slow, silent conquest of nature by industry. We can almost feel the texture of the soil change beneath our feet. What was once rich, dark earth, held together by a web of roots, is now little more than loose red sand. When the winds came, and they came with increasing fury, they lifted the topsoil into the air, creating vast, choking clouds that would have scourged the fields and buried homes. For the farmers living in the shadow of Meroë, the world was literally blowing away. Their ancestors had understood the rhythms of the savanna, the partnership between the grass, the trees, and the seasonal rains. That ancient wisdom was being erased, one charcoal fire at a time. Imagine you are a farmer in the 2nd century of the Common Era. The Nile's annual flood, the event your entire existence depends upon, has become a fickle beast. One year it is too weak, its waters carrying more sand than life-giving silt from the barren highlands. The next, a sudden violent downpour in the denuded hills sends a flash flood surging through your fields, washing away the precious soil the river failed to deliver. We are witnessing the breakdown of a system that had sustained life here for millennia. The kingdom's agricultural base, the very foundation upon which the forges, the palaces, and the pyramids were built, was beginning to fracture under the immense, unrelenting pressure of its own success. Back within the city walls, the machine kept running. We can picture the royal scribes in their cool stone offices, dutifully recording the number of iron bars shipped to the coast, the weight of gold received in trade, the taxes collected. By these metrics, the kingdom was thriving. The wealth of Meroë insulated its elite from the quiet desperation growing in the countryside. They saw the ever-increasing loads of charcoal arriving at the gates not as a symptom of a dying landscape, but as proof of their robust economy. It is a chillingly familiar story of a leadership completely disconnected from the environmental cost of their power, measuring profit while ignoring the depletion of their true capital, the land itself. Here we uncover the fatal flaw in their grand design. The Kushite kingdom had become a great tree, magnificent in its size and strength, yet it was systematically poisoning its own roots. The very process that made its branches strong and its canopy wide was killing the soil that nourished it. This was no longer a simple problem of resource management. It was a deep systemic crisis that was turning the kingdom into a hollow shell. The wealth flowing from the forges was now a fever, a sign of a sickness that was consuming the kingdom from its very soil upward. The first signs that the kingdom was eating itself alive were not recorded in royal decrees or merchants' ledgers. They were absences. The sudden silence in a village where children once played, the empty space in the sky where a flock of birds used to wheel at dawn. Let us stand for a moment in the ruins of one such forgotten settlement, a few hours' journey from the capital. The mud brick walls have crumbled into mounds that the wind is slowly reclaiming. We find no tools, no pottery, nothing of value left behind. Even the wooden lintels from the doorways are gone, likely scavenged long ago as precious fuel. The only sound here is the endless whisper of sand scouring stone, a sound like a drawn-out sigh for a world that has vanished. We can trace the invisible lines of desperation that radiated from these dead zones. They all led to one place, the Nile. A great internal migration began. A slow tide of displaced people seeking refuge along the river's shrinking floodplain. For perhaps 200 years, the communities on the riverbank absorbed their cousins from the interior, sharing what little they had. But the land, exhausted and starved of nutrients, could not support the growing numbers. We see a society beginning to fray at the seams. Disputes over water rights, grazing lands, and fishing spots would have become more common, more venomous. The strong communal bonds that had defined Kushite society for centuries were being ground down by the simple, brutal arithmetic of scarcity. Meanwhile, in Meroë, the insatiable hunger of the forges only grew more acute. Charcoal, once a common good, became a strategic commodity. We can envision caravans now traveling under armed guard, not to protect them from foreign bandits, but to prevent their own desperate people from stealing the fuel. This had a catastrophic effect on their economy. The cost of producing a single iron spearhead would have skyrocketed, eating into the profits that sustained the state. Their famed Meroitic steel, the very product of their genius, was becoming too expensive to make. Rival powers like the burgeoning Kingdom of Kush to the southeast, with its rich forested highlands, would have found their own iron goods suddenly competitive. The economic pillar of the kingdom was cracking under its own weight. Imagine the dilemma facing the Kandakes and her advisors within the cool palace walls. They were not ignorant people. They could see the dust storms on the horizon and hear the reports of failing harvests. Yet, what could they do? To stop the forges, even for a single generation, would be to signal weakness to their enemies and trigger a complete economic collapse. The entire state apparatus, from the army to the priesthood, was funded by iron. They were trapped in a system of their own creation. Their only perceived path to survival in the present was to continue the very activity that guaranteed their destruction in the future. We find a leadership paralyzed, forced to choose between a quick death and a slow one. The vibrant, confident culture that had once challenged Rome and resurrected the glory of the pharaohs was now turning inward, consuming its own body to fuel a fire that could no longer be extinguished. Every decision made to maintain power and prosperity only accelerated the decline. The sound of the axe had faded from the surrounding lands, replaced by the grim silence of a barren earth. The forges that had once armed a nation against its enemies now forged the very chains of its inevitable self-inflicted collapse. By the 4th century of the Common Era, the change was no longer a matter of seasons, but of the very substance of the world. Let us feel the air here. It is different. It is thinner, drier, and carries a persistent heat that seems to rise not just from the sun, but from the baked ground itself. We are now witnessing the grim climax of their ecological catastrophe, the creation of a new climate. The vast woodlands had acted as a great green lung, breathing moisture into the atmosphere. With that lung ripped out, the delicate cycle of evaporation and rainfall collapsed completely. The sky over Meroë simply forgot how to make rain. Here, we can piece together the final fatal equation. Less rain meant the remaining vegetation withered, exposing more soil. That bare earth reflected the sun's heat with ferocious intensity, creating a permanent high-pressure zone that actively repelled rain-bearing clouds. We are looking at the birth of a man-made desert, a feedback loop of desiccation that was now irreversible and self-sustaining. The Kushites were no longer simply living in a damaged environment. They had terraformed their homeland into an alien landscape hostile to the very life it once nurtured. The land itself had become their enemy. Imagine the profound sense of betrayal they must have felt watching the Nile. The great river, the eternal god Hapi, had turned against them. For millennia, its flood had been a gentle, predictable blessing. Now, when the rare rains did fall on the distant, denuded Ethiopian highlands, they came not as a saving grace, but as a destructive torrent. We can picture a wall of brown water, thick with gravel and sand, scouring the narrow floodplains, stripping away what little fertility remained. The river that had been the cradle of their civilization was now actively clawing it apart, its waters carrying death instead of life. The silence that fell upon the land would have been the most unnerving change of all. The great herds of elephants, giraffes, and antelope that had once populated the savanna were gone, having migrated away or starved. The lions that hunted them had vanished. We are walking through a ghost ecosystem, a world emptied of its vibrant soul. In the city, this silence would have been met with a frantic, desperate noise. The priests in the temple of Amun would have multiplied their sacrifices, their chants growing louder, more frantic, begging for a divine intervention that would never come. Their gods, it seemed, had either abandoned them or were powerless against a force of their own making. The great slag heaps, those black mountains of industrial waste, now stood as the sole monuments in a barren wilderness. They were no longer symbols of power and wealth, but grim tombstones for 1,000,000 vanished trees. Meroë had become an island, its magnificent temples and pyramids marooned in a sea of red sand. The kingdom that had once commanded the respect of Rome and held the legacy of the pharaohs was now a patient on its deathbed, the cause of its sickness pumping from the cold, silent heart of its own forges. The earth was scorched, and with it the future of the Kushite people. Let us approach the city walls not from the grand river gate, but from the east, through the wasteland of its own making. Here, the primary defenses are no longer stone and rampart, but the great black glaciers of slag that have crept forward over the generations. We see them swallowing the outer roads, burying the tombs of lesser nobles, a slow, dark tide of industrial refuse. Imagine living here in these final years. The very air would have been a fine grit, a mixture of red desert dust and black metallic powder that coated every surface, soured every drink of water, and worked its way deep into the lungs of every citizen. The city was choking on the physical byproduct of its own greatness. Inside the royal city, we find a world struggling to maintain its former glory. The once vibrant murals on temple walls depicting the triumphs of the Kandakes and the glory of the gods are veiled in a uniform layer of grime. We can picture the strained efforts of the priests to keep the sacred precincts clean, a losing battle against an enemy that fell from the sky with every gust of wind. The grand marketplace, which once echoed with a dozen languages and the clamor of commerce, would have grown quieter. The goods for sale are fewer, the merchants more anxious. We could almost taste the anxiety that hung in the air alongside the dust, the unspoken fear that the caravans were not just late, but were never coming back. This was a profound psychological shift. The Kushite identity had been forged in the furnace, their pride intrinsically linked to their metallurgical prowess. For 1,000 years, the glow of the forges was a symbol of strength and divine favor. Now, we are left to wonder if they looked upon those cooling furnace mounds with resentment, even dread. Did they see them as the cursed altars of a dead god, monuments to a fatal bargain that had cost them the world? We see here the death of a national spirit. A people who had once seen themselves as masters of the elements were now reduced to subjects of a hostile environment they had created. Their confidence had eroded, just like their topsoil. The physical toll on the population must have been devastating. We find in the skeletal remains from this period evidence of increased respiratory ailments and malnutrition. The people of Meroë, once nourished by a productive land, were now weakened, their bodies recording the slow starvation of their kingdom. A society in this state is brittle, fragile. Its institutions, from the army to the granaries, are hollowed out from within, lacking the resources and the collective will to face a significant crisis. The rulers in their palaces could issue decrees, but they could not command the rain to fall or the soil to return. They were kings and queens of a city of ghosts, presiding over a magnificent empty husk. This internal decay, this deep sickness of land and spirit, did not go unnoticed. A kingdom so visibly weakened becomes a temptation. Its legendary wealth, now a fading memory, still shone brightly in the minds of its rivals. Beyond the red desert, new powers were rising, hungry and ambitious, watching the perpetual haze over Meroë not as a sign of industry, but as a pillar of smoke rising from a dying fire. The city's self-inflicted wounds had left it exposed, its formidable reputation the only shield it had left, and that shield was beginning to crack. For a generation now, the memory of real rain had become a myth, a tale told by grandparents to wide-eyed children who could not imagine a sky that wept. The stories spoke of a world painted in green, of air so thick with moisture you could taste it, of a land that gave freely. Let us listen to the words of these elders, their voices as dry and cracked as the riverbed. They are describing a paradise that now sounds like a land of gods and magic. We are witnessing the birth of a people culturally unmoored, a society whose entire foundation myth, a covenant with a fertile land, has been broken. The promise of the earth was now a lie. The great temple of Amun, once the spiritual heart of the empire, now echoed with a desperate hollow piety. We can imagine the high priests, men whose authority rested on their ability to interpret the will of the gods, performing their rituals with a frantic precision. They would have pleaded with the stone effigies, offering the last of the kingdom's wealth, perhaps even resorting to darker forgotten rites in the deep chambers of the temple. But the sky remained a sheet of brass. The gods of Meroë, who had ridden with their armies into Egypt and blessed their forges with fire, had fallen silent. For the common person, this divine silence was more terrifying than any invading army. It was an abandonment. The physical infrastructure of their ancestors now stood as a silent rebuke to their own impotence. The complex network of canals and reservoirs, marvels of engineering designed to manage the Nile's bounty, were now choked arteries of dust and sand. We can picture work crews, thin and weakened by poor nutrition, trying to clear a channel with wooden shovels, only for the wind to undo their labor in a single afternoon. The grand royal granaries, built to store years of surplus grain, were now vast, echoing chambers where rats starved. Their past genius mocked their present helplessness. A kingdom that could no longer feed its people or provide them with water had broken the most fundamental contract between ruler and ruled. This pervasive weakness was a scent on the wind, a story carried by the few hardy traders who still braved the journey. Far to the southeast, in the high, cool mountains of Ethiopia, the rival kingdom of Aksum was listening. Their king, Azana, a recent and fervent convert to Christianity, would have heard tales of a pagan kingdom in its death throes. We can envision his scouts returning not with accounts of formidable Meroitic armies, but of starving villages and a capital city shrouded in its own filth. The legendary iron masters of the Nile were now a prize waiting to be taken, their famed wealth a treasure protected by ghosts. Here, in the final years, the once mighty Kushite kingdom was a kingdom holding its breath. The smoke from the forges had long since thinned to a pathetic wisp, the roar of industry replaced by the whisper of sand. They were a people trapped between a past they could no longer reclaim and a future that was rushing towards them like a storm cloud over a barren plain. The great light of Meroë, which had burned brightly for 1,000 years, was now flickering, and its people could do nothing but watch as a long shadow began to fall across their scorched and broken land. The shadow that had been gathering on the horizon now had a name, Ezana. Around the year 350 of the Common Era, the Christian king of Aksum marched his armies across the blighted plains. We can envision his forces not as a horde, but as a disciplined, purposeful wave. These were men of the highlands, strong from good harvests, their iron weapons sharp, their faith absolute. They were moving against a ghost, an empire whose heart had stopped beating long before their arrival. The resistance they met was not the fury of a proud warrior nation, but the brittle, desperate lashing out of a people with nothing left to lose. Let us stand with the last Meroitic garrison at the city gates. We see men whose fathers had been master smiths, now armed with rusted spear points in a gnawing hunger. Their armor is patched, their shields splintered. They face an enemy whose strength seems supernatural, a force nourished by the very rains that had forsaken their own land. The ensuing clash was less a battle and more a breaking. The once legendary might of Kush, the power that had conquered Egypt and defied Rome, shattered like sun-baked clay. The Aksumite war horn sounded not a challenge, but a final judgment. We follow the victorious soldiers as they pour into the royal city. They found no great treasures to plunder, no overflowing storerooms. Instead, they discovered a capital hollowed out by despair, its grand avenues coated in a film of black and red dust. Here we witness the final brutal transaction of history. Ezana of Aksum, in a grand inscription he would later commission to commemorate his victory, tells us he came to punish a rebellious people. But we see a different story. We see a new power extinguishing an old one, an act of succession disguised as retribution. His forces moved with grim efficiency through the streets, their primary target not the palace treasury, but the city's soul. Imagine the scene at the great temple of Apetamak, the fierce lion-headed god who had been the divine patron of Meroë for centuries. We can almost hear the splintering of sacred timbers and the sickening crash of stone as the Aksumite soldiers, fired by a new and zealous faith, toppled the statues of the old gods. For them, this was not vandalism, it was a righteous cleansing. They were tearing down the idols of a failed religion, a faith that had promised prosperity and delivered only dust. For the people of Meroë, huddled in their homes, each crash was another beat in a funeral drum for their entire world. The tears of the lion god were the stones of his own temple tumbling into the dirt. King Ezana stood as master of a dead city. He burned what was left, took the survivors as slaves, and claimed the territory for his own Christian god. The last fires of Meroë lit up the slag heaps, making them gleam like mountains of black glass under a pitiless moon. As the Aksumites marched their captives away, the Kushite people were scattered to the winds, their language soon to be forgotten, their great history swallowed by the desert they had made. They had forged a kingdom of iron that lasted 1,000 years, and now they were leaving behind only a kingdom of dust. After the last Aksumite soldier departed and the final embers of the city cooled, a new conqueror arrived. This one was patient, silent, and relentless. It was the sand. For more than 1,400 years, the silence held, broken only by the whisper of the wind. We can picture the dunes advancing like a slow golden tide, burying the avenues, filling the temples, and climbing the steep faces of the pyramids until only their sharp peaks remained, like lonely gravestones in an ocean of ochre. The great slag heaps, too vast to be completely covered, were scoured and shaped by the elements until they almost resembled natural hills, their dark presence a forgotten secret on the landscape. Meroë did not just die, it was entombed. Its name faded into a footnote in the texts of Greek and Roman historians, a half-mythical place somewhere deep in a land they called Ethiopia. Then, in the year 1821, the silence was finally disturbed. Let us join a French mineralogist named Frédéric Caillot, part of an expedition pushing south along the Nile far deeper than most Europeans had ever dared. We can imagine his journey, the oppressive heat, the warnings from locals about the desolate lands ahead. And then he saw it. Rising from the endless sea of sand were the tips of over 40 pyramids. We can share in his astonishment the sheer improbability of such a structure, let alone a whole city of them existing in this forgotten wasteland. This was not Egypt. This was something else, something lost and profoundly ancient. He had stumbled upon the royal necropolis of a ghost kingdom. Caillot and the explorers who followed began the slow work of mapping and sketching, revealing the bones of a civilization that had been lost to the world. This first contact, however, was not always gentle. We then encounter figures far less concerned with preservation. We are talking about men like the Italian adventurer Giuseppe Ferlini, who was a treasure hunter first, and a historian a distant second. In the year 1834, he infamously used gunpowder to blow the top from the pyramid of the Kandake Amanishaketo. He found a spectacular cache of gold, but the cost of that discovery was the obliteration of the monument that housed it. Here we witness a tragic echo of Meroë's own story, a short-sighted quest for immediate wealth leading to the destruction of an irreplaceable resource. The treasures Ferlini carried back to Europe sparked immense interest, but they told a skewed story of gold and jewels, not of iron and ruin. The greatest clue to the real story of Meroë, however, was hiding in plain sight. These early explorers and archaeologists saw the colossal black mounds surrounding the city, but they could not fully comprehend their meaning. We see in their journals descriptions of these strange hills of scoria, some speculating they were volcanic in origin. They stood upon the evidence of Africa's first great industrial revolution and did not recognize it. They could see the magnificent temples and the royal tombs, the clear evidence of a powerful monarchy. But they could not yet connect the grand monuments to the dark, glassy refuse that surrounded them. The puzzle of Meroë was only half assembled. They had found the kings and queens, but the true source of their power and the instrument of their downfall was still a mystery written in a language of Slag they had not yet learned to read. The gold Ferlini plundered from that desecrated pyramid told a story far more profound than one of simple riches. Let us look closer at these magnificent objects, not as treasure, but as evidence. We see ram-headed sphinxes, intricate shields, and armlets depicting the gods, but these were not worn by kings alone. They belonged to a succession of women who wielded a power almost unthinkable to their contemporaries in Rome or Athens. We are now uncovering the secret of the Candaces, the warrior queens of Kush. This was not a title for a king's passive wife. It was the designation for a female head of state, a ruler in her own right, whose authority was absolute and whose command was law. To understand their position, we must completely recalibrate our modern and classical assumptions about gender and power. In the Kushite kingdom, the royal line was often traced through the mother. It was the queen mother who held the keys to legitimacy, who bestowed upon a son the right to rule. Often she chose to rule herself. We find their images carved in stone on temple pylons, depicted with the same stature and authority as any male pharaoh. They are shown as broad, powerful figures, adorned with regalia and scars, leading armies into battle or making offerings directly to the gods. This was not a society where women were relegated to the shadows. Here, they could be the storm itself. Perhaps no story illustrates this better than that of the Kandake Amanirenas, the one-eyed queen who stared down the might of the Roman Empire. Around the year 25 before the Common Era, when Roman legions pushed south to annex her kingdom, she did not sue for peace. She led her army in a furious counterattack. We can only imagine the shock of the Roman soldiers, accustomed to fighting bearded barbarian kings, now facing a disciplined force commanded by a woman who had lost an eye in a previous battle and was not afraid to lose the other. She drove the Romans from her territory and, in an act of supreme defiance, captured several bronze likenesses of the Emperor Augustus. One of these captured heads was taken back to Meroë and buried deliberately beneath the threshold of a temple dedicated to victory. Let us pause to appreciate the breathtaking symbolism of this act. For years, every person entering the temple would have unknowingly stomped on the face of the most powerful man in the world. It was a message of utter contempt and unbreakable will. Amanirenas eventually negotiated a peace treaty with Rome that was so favorable it established a stable border for centuries. She was not a subject, but an equal. We see in her the embodiment of Kushite power, shrewd, ferocious, and absolutely unwilling to bow. Yet these formidable women, who could outwit Roman generals and command the loyalty of armies, were also the chief executives of the industrial machine that was devouring their kingdom. They presided over the decades of greatest production, their military successes demanding an ever greater supply of iron for weapons and tools. The Kandakes were brilliant strategists and politicians, but they too were trapped by the same ecological blindness as their male predecessors. Their power, symbolized by the fire of the forge, was inextricably linked to the slow death of the land they so fiercely defended. We are left with the tragic image of a queen winning a war against the world's greatest superpower, only to lose the silent, undeclared war against her own kingdom's insatiable appetite. Here we must look beyond the fallen stones and scattered bones to confront the central haunting question of Meroë. How could a civilization of such profound genius be so catastrophically foolish? We have seen their technological mastery in the forge, their political acumen in the face of Rome, and their deep cultural confidence carved into every temple wall. This was not a primitive society that stumbled into ruin. They were, by any ancient standard, a people at the peak of their intelligence, and yet they failed. Their downfall reveals a flaw far deeper than poor resource management. It was a failure of perception, a blindness not of the eyes, but of the soul. The Kushites compartmentalized their world. We can see it in the very layout of their city. Here was the sacred quarter for the gods, there the royal quarter for the rulers, and over there the industrial quarter for the forges. In their minds, the forest was yet another compartment, a vast storeroom of fuel, disconnected from the farms that fed them and the river that gave them water. They never seemed to grasp that these were not separate kingdoms, but a single, delicately interwoven system. Every axe that fell in the woods was a blow not just to a tree, but to the sky's ability to produce rain and the soil's ability to hold life. They understood the intricate mechanics of their furnaces, but failed to see the far more complex mechanics of the world that sustained them. Let us ask what it would have taken to change course. It would have required a leader, a Kandake or a king, to stand before the priests and generals and declare that their greatest strength was now their greatest poison. They would have had to voluntarily dismantle the very engine of their economy, the source of their military might and international prestige. We are talking about an act of almost unimaginable political courage, an act that would have looked like madness and weakness to their rivals and their own people. The momentum of 1,000 years of success was too powerful to reverse. The system was now running on its own, its operators trapped within a machine they could no longer control, compelled to feed it even as it consumed the foundations of their own house. This is where the story of Meroë ceases to be a tale of the distant past and becomes an unnervingly familiar echo. We are forced to confront a pattern deeply embedded in human civilization, the pursuit of a singular measure of success, be it iron production or economic growth, at the expense of the complex vital systems that make that success possible. The Kushites mastered fire, but not its consequences. They built an economy that appeared limitlessly profitable because the true costs, the degradation of the air, water, and soil, were never entered into their ledgers. They were left off the balance sheet, a debt passed on to the future, until the future finally arrived and declared the kingdom bankrupt. We find ourselves standing once more before the great black mountains of Slag, but now we see them differently. They are not just the refuse of a dead industry, they are the physical embodiment of a fatal idea. They are monuments to the belief that a society can be endlessly sustained by a process that destroys its own environment. The Kushite kingdom offers no easy answers, only a profound and sobering warning. It is the story of a brilliant people who became the architects of their own oblivion, leaving behind a scorched and silent land to ask a question that now rings through our own time. Can a civilization become too clever to survive? What, then, is the inheritance of a kingdom that dies by its own hand? We search for a legacy among the ruins and find only paradoxes. The Kushite people themselves were not erased from the earth. They became a diaspora, a great scattering into the lands south and west. We can imagine them carrying not treasures of iron, but memories of a green world, their skills as farmers and herders now essential for survival in new territories. They blended into the populations that would eventually form the Christian kingdoms of medieval Nubia, their distinct language and identity slowly dissolving like a tablet of clay left out in a rare storm. Their unique Meroitic script, a final testament to their independent genius, fell into a final illiterate silence, its secrets locked away forever. Here we find perhaps the most profound tragedy. The descendants of the Black Pharaohs, the people who had built a literate urban and technologically advanced civilization, were rendered voiceless. Their story, for the next 1,500 years, would be told only by the mute testimony of their pyramids and the confused accounts of foreign historians. They became a phantom limb of a kingdom, a cultural presence whose origins were shrouded in mystery. Their bloodline continued, woven into the fabric of modern Sudan, but their grand imperial narrative was broken, its pages scattered and buried by the very sand they had unleashed. Their ultimate creation was not a dynasty, but a cautionary tale they themselves could no longer read. Yet something did endure, defying the sand and the silence. Let us return to those steep, sharp pyramids. They remain, even after Ferlini's gunpowder and the endless abrasion of the wind. They are a stubborn fact on the landscape, a declaration of permanence that outlasted the very environment that made them possible. They stand as monuments to a people who saw themselves as eternal, as true heirs to the pharaohs. But we see them now as part of a larger, more somber memorial. The pyramids are the headstones, and the vast, dark slag heaps that surround them are the body of the tomb, a sarcophagus made from the residue of their own ambition. It is a legacy written in two starkly different materials, the stone of divine aspiration and the industrial waste of ecological collapse. We have journeyed together down the Nile, from the conquest of Egypt to the quiet desperation of a dying city. We have walked through a history of immense power, of brilliant innovation, and of a slow, creeping blindness that proved fatal. The story of Meroë is the story of a people who mastered the element of fire, but forgot their covenant with the earth, a civilization that traded a sustainable world for a millennium of unsustainable growth. It is an ancient story, but the ghost of its machine haunts us still. We are left with their warning, a whisper carried on the hot desert wind, a message from the past about the true price of power. The great kingdom of Kush demonstrates that a civilization's most brilliant innovation can become the very instrument of its undoing. Their slag heaps are a stark reminder that progress without foresight is a path to oblivion. What are the slag heaps we are building today, and will we learn to read their meaning before our own reigns stop for good? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. To continue exploring these critical lessons from our shared history, make sure you subscribe and join our ongoing expedition.